Okay, in this video I want to focus on how we can create an application within Speak. So first I want to focus on building a simple application. The application is basically going to list a bunch of items that are within our Cycle repository. I'm going to use a number of different controls. So I'm just going to exit out of this PowerPoint, and I have Visual Studio up here. See here I have my site. Now just will mention that you do need Cycle Rocks in order to do development within Speak. So in my Cycle Explorer I have my site here. Now I'm in the core database right now, and I'm in client and then your applications, and I have a folder here called Transport, which I originally created it within. Now what I'm going to do is just add my Speak application here. So I'm just going to go add new item. Now if I search for page, it should narrow this search results a lot, and we want to go down to this branches and then the applications. This gives us 3 different types of applications we can create. Essentially they're the same, they just have a different layout associated with it and different controls that will come with it. But you could also edit these controls and the layout to suit your purpose if need be. In this case I'm just going to create this task page, and I'll just name it Speak Task. Okay, so now I have my Speak Task page. If I actually go into the internet browser, and I'll just move this over, and I hit this URL, and it's in trend spot and then Speak Task. We'll get our application here. Now I haven't added anything to it right now, so it's basically what you get as a default application: a back button, a save button, this title banner, and that's really it. So I'm going to minimize that and we're going to actually add some renderings to this. Now out of the box, or by default, you'll have this page settings, which is where you should store all your content for the application. I'll go into that in more detail in just a bit. But to actually create and modify these, as I mentioned, these are still a Cycle item with a layout, so we just go into the presentation or the design layout of it. And what this will do is list all the actual renderings associated with this. So we can see we have this save button and the back button there. Now if we go to the add rendering button at the top, we can add a number of different renderings that are available. I'm just going to add a text field rendering, and we're just going to display this my new text field. And this is a rendering, so we have it on a placeholder, so we're just going to put it in the application content main placeholder. Now we'll save that, and I'll just go back to my page, my application, and refresh that, and we have this text field that's now been added to our application. So this is the gist of how to add controls. And there, as I mentioned, there's like over 50 different controls within the standard component library that's included within Speak, but I will focus on creating your own custom controls later on. Now to make this a bit more dynamic, what I'm going to do is add a text box, and we're going to edit our text. So we have this text box control, and I might add a watermark, enter text here. These are essentially fields, much like your fields within a Cycle item. And so now when we enter this watermark, it will basically provide us with essentially a watermark for that text box. What we actually want to do is open the text rendering, and we want to bind the text value to equal whatever's in the text box, so the text box.text. So I'll close that and save that. So what that means is whatever's going to be within this field here will be displayed in the text field rendering. So I'm going to close that and go back to our browser and just refresh this page. So we have a text field here, and we have nothing in it. But if I enter something like my text, it will update our text field. Right now they're both within the same placeholder, so they're just the text field is pushing this text box across. But we can keep updating it like so. There are further controls that you can add for the actual layout, such as the row panel. So what I might do is I'll just add 2 of those. And what this will allow us to do is separate our actual controls. So on the placeholder key, we can now put this in the row panel content, and text value in the row panel 1 content. Now we can change the IDs so that they're a bit easier to understand. So text field row, and I'll change the ID of the second one to text box row. Okay, now we'll save that and we'll go back and enter some text here, and they're now in separated rows. Now what I'm going to do is add a list control and display content from our actual database. So I'm going to go back to the Speak presentation design layout, and I'm going to add another rendering. Now, as I mentioned, because this is all client side, we need to house the data on the client, so within our Speak application. To do so, we have these data source items. So if I search data source, out of there, data source, we'll find a couple here. There are a number of different ones available, and this has been updated as well for the new version of Speak in 7.5 and 8. But for this example, I'm just going to use the search data source. What this allows us to do is search a database through these fields. So we're going to search the master database, and we're going to search it based on the text of our text box. So whatever we enter in our text box is going to search through the master database and pull back a list of items, which is here. We can't actually edit this because this field is just to store those items in. Now we're going to display it. This will just hold the data. We still need to display it, so we're going to display it with another rendering called a list control. And this list control will display whatever's in the items field. So if we bind this item field to our data source items, whenever that data source is updated, this items field will be updated, and then it will display the data. Now there's a second part to this, which is how we display the data in terms of what fields we want to display. So this list control will actually reference another item within the cycle, and that's an actual list control. So what I want to do is I'm just going to go into the page settings of our application and insert a new folder, and I'm going to call it search control. And this is where we're going to put our actual item, which will tell us which columns and fields we want to display. So if we add an item here and we search for list control, we'll get this new item. Now this item here will define a bunch of columns and names that we want to actually pull the values from of our search data source. So we're just going to add a new column field item, call this item name, and so the header will be item name, and the data field will just be item name. So this is a standard cycle data field. So it could also be database or any of the standard standard fields, or a field that you need. So we'll save that, and we'll just add another column here, and we'll call this database. And from database, this will just list the database. So again, these are standard cycle fields. So that will do. Okay, so we'll save that. So this control has 2 sub-items, which define a particular column that we want to pull values back from. And so if we go back to our task layout, and we have this list control here, this list control is going to be represented by that item we created. So the data source for this actual presentation component will link it to our list control that we just created, or this one down here. There. So now it will pull back all the items which match the query with those two field names. So I'll just save that, and just before I do anything else, I'm going to insert this on another row. So I'm going to add a row, and I'm going to call this search row. Okay, so close that, and I'm just going to insert this and assign it to the row I've just added, so to the placeholder, search row panel content. Okay, I'm happy with that. I'll go back to my application and refresh now. We have this massive list control item, and if I enter something like sample, it will display a list of items, and these are based off those fields. So just to give you a better understanding, if I link it to this other list control which I created before, which just has this updated field here, which is just the standard field updated by. So I'll go into my list control rendering, and I'll set the data source to equal this other one I've created previously, which has it updated. I'll save that, we'll go back, refresh this, so we have an updated field. I'll put in sample, and it has who it was updated by. So that's it. It is fairly simple. Essentially, we're pulling a list of items, we're storing them as JSON objects into a field, and they are represented by this list control. Now this list control represents that using this data source, which presents a data using this data source, which it references another item, another list control. Okay. Now we can do more things with the event binding, so what I'll quickly show you is just how we can change the display of this text to only render if there are no items. So this text is actually going to be static text and say no items found, and we're going to render that is visible to be based off whether the data source has no items. So whenever that is true for our data source, I believe, yep, has no items, then we'll get the text to display has no items found. So we'll close that and save that. Go back to our Speak application and refresh it. And so we have no items found. When we hit sample, that disappears. So we can actually bind any of these fields to equal values from other components, and this is where we start to get this model view model and this data binding, which makes Speak applications pretty powerful. Now I'll go into more detail in the next video on how to actually create these components. I'll just switch back to my PowerPoint and go through some of the logic. So just go. So we built a simple application. It had the search data source, the list control, text box. Now the breakdown of the application. So we have a layout that has a JavaScript file. Now I didn't actually go into this, but I probably will later on. One of the renderings that are actually available on the each Speak application will be a page code rendering, and that is how you can reference a JavaScript or a C# file, which can actually provide logic to your overall application, and you can use it to reference these actual renderings by their IDs directly and then modify their fields. I'll go into that in more detail later. So in this example we have the page code, and we can update the header title text to my page header. As such, it will update that. Now, as well as that, we can do binding between components. So as you saw in my demo, we had a text field, and we could manually enter in the text, and we could bind that to the value and display it like so, or we could bind it between two components. So I flipped off, that's too soon. So we could have the text, the header title, equal the value of another component. Okay,